You believe that your ego is you, that the sense of I that you carry through life is your actual self, that the identity you have constructed from your achievements and beliefs and roles and preferences is the foundation of who you are. But Carl Jung understood what most people never discover. Your ego is not you, it is a construction, a necessary illusion that begins as developmental achievement in childhood, but becomes psychological prison in adulthood, a limitation you mistake for liberation, a jailer you mistake for freedom. The ego destroys you not through obvious vice or acknowledged weakness, but through its core function, through what it is designed to do, through the very mechanisms that make it feel like solid ground beneath your feet. It destroys you by demanding that you remain consistent when growth requires change, by insisting you maintain continuous identity when transformation requires dissolution, by forcing you to defend positions that no longer serve you, by creating suffering through comparison and superiority, and the endless need to prove your worth through external validation and achievement. Jung spent his life studying how the ego operates, how it defends itself, how it creates the very suffering it claims to prevent, how it imprisons people in patterns they cannot break, because breaking them would threaten the ego's sense of continuity, would require experiencing what Jung called ego death, would mean facing that who you believe yourself to be is not who you actually are, but is construction maintained through constant psychological effort that exhausts you while convincing you it is necessary for survival. Understanding why your ego is destroying you requires examining what the ego actually is, how it operates, what it defends against, and what exists beyond its boundaries when you finally have courage to let it dissolve. The ego in Jungian psychology is not the villain that popular spirituality makes it out to be, but is necessary structure, is the part of psyche that says I and that distinguishes self from other, that creates coherent sense of being continuous entity rather than collection of disconnected experiences without unifying center. The ego emerges in childhood as developmental achievement, as capacity to recognize yourself as separate individual with particular characteristics and preferences, as ability to organize experience into narrative about who you are that persists across time and circumstances. But what begins as necessary development becomes limitation because the ego cannot tolerate being anything other than what it has decided it is, demands consistency even when consistency means refusing growth, requires continuity even when continuity means remaining trapped in patterns that no longer serve. The ego identifies with certain qualities and then must defend those identifications regardless of whether they reflect current reality, must maintain the image it has constructed regardless of the cost to your actual well-being or authentic living. The destruction begins with this rigidity, with the ego's refusal to allow change that would threaten its sense of continuity, with its need to be today who you were yesterday, regardless of whether that identity serves current circumstances or reflects current understanding. You construct identity around being certain kind of person, and then you must be that person, must perform that role, must maintain that image, even when maintaining it requires suppressing authentic responses, denying genuine feelings, refusing opportunities that would require you to be someone different than who the ego has decided you are. The ego creates what Jung called the persona, the mask you show to the world, the performed version of yourself that fits social expectations and gains approval. But the persona is not the problem. The problem is when you mistake the persona for your actual self, when you believe the performance is reality, when you invest so completely in maintaining the image that you forget there is anything beneath it, when the ego becomes so identified with the persona that dropping the mask feels like death rather than like liberation. This identification with the constructed self is first way the ego destroys you, creates life where you are never actually yourself but are always performing, always maintaining image, always defending identity that does not reflect who you actually are, beneath all the adaptation and self-protection and need for approval. The ego destroys you through constant comparison, through measuring yourself against others, through needing to be superior or at least not inferior, through creating suffering from circumstances that would be neutral if the ego were not constantly evaluating where you stand relative to everyone else. Jung recognized that the ego's sense of itself is not stable or self-contained, but is always relative, is always defined through comparison, needs others to be less than you, or needs to see yourself as better than them in order to feel adequate or valuable or worthy. This comparative consciousness creates constant suffering because you can never be superior in all domains, can never be the best at everything. You can always find someone who has more or achieves more or appears happier or more successful or more attractive or more intelligent. The ego experiences others' success as threat rather than as neutral fact, feels diminished when others excel, needs them to fail, or needs to find flaws in their success in order to protect its own sense of adequacy. The comparison also creates envy that masquerades as other emotions, creates resentment that disguises itself as moral judgment, creates satisfaction in others' failures that the ego cannot acknowledge, because acknowledging it would threaten the image of being a good person who does not take pleasure in others' pain. You are not happy for others' success because their success highlights your perceived inadequacy, are secretly pleased when they fail because their failure makes your position feel more secure, judge them harshly for qualities you possess but cannot acknowledge in yourself. This creates exhausting life where you are never at peace, where every interaction contains implicit competition, where you must constantly monitor your status relative to others, where you cannot genuinely celebrate others' achievements because their achievements feel like indictments of your failures. The ego keeps you trapped in an endless game of comparison where winning is temporary and losing is catastrophic, where you can never achieve lasting sense of adequacy, because adequacy depends on maintaining superiority that can always be threatened by someone else's achievement. The destruction here is not in the comparison itself, but in the suffering it creates, in the way it prevents genuine connection by making every relationship contain an element of competition, in the way it makes you smaller by requiring that others be smaller, in the way it ensures you can never be satisfied, because satisfaction would require the ego to stop comparing, and the ego cannot stop comparing, because comparison is how it knows itself. The ego destroys you through its terror of change, through its fundamental need to remain who you have been, through its experience of transformation as death rather than as growth, through its refusal to allow the dissolution that genuine development requires. Jung understood that psychological growth necessitates what he called ego death, moments where the identity you have constructed must dissolve to allow something new to emerge, where who you have been must die so that who you are becoming can be born. But the ego experiences this necessary dissolution as existential threat, mobilizes all its defenses against change that would require fundamental revision of identity, clings to familiar patterns, even when those patterns create obvious suffering, chooses known misery over unknown possibility, because the unknown threatens the continuity that the ego exists to maintain. You remain in relationships that no longer work because leaving would require becoming someone who leaves. Stay in careers that drain you because quitting would threaten your identity as person who perseveres. Maintain beliefs that no longer serve you because changing your mind would mean admitting you were wrong, which the ego cannot tolerate without experiencing it as catastrophic failure. This clinging to continuity creates stagnation disguised as stability, creates refusal to grow disguised as integrity, creates loyalty to past self that is actually betrayal of present self and future possibility. The ego would rather be consistently wrong than admit error, would rather maintain outdated position than update based on new information, would rather sacrifice well-being than sacrifice the identity it has spent years constructing. The terror of change also prevents the ego from acknowledging its own impermanence, from facing that the person you are today will not be the person you are in 10 years, that change is inevitable regardless of the ego's resistance, that clinging to continuity does not prevent change, but only makes change more difficult and painful when it finally becomes unavoidable. The ego tries to create permanent self in reality that is constantly changing, tries to maintain fixed identity in life that requires constant adaptation, tries to remain static in universe characterized by transformation. This creates suffering that Jung called neurosis, creates conflict between the ego's need for continuity and life's requirement for change, creates paralysis, where you cannot move forward, because moving forward would require becoming someone different, and cannot remain where you are, because where you are is unsustainable, creates the stuck feeling that characterizes so much of human psychological suffering. The ego destroys you through its relationship to the shadow, through its need to deny aspects of yourself that contradict the identity it has constructed, through creating split between acceptable self and unacceptable self, where everything rejected accumulates in the unconscious and operates without your awareness or control. Jung's concept of the shadow is central to understanding how the ego creates suffering. The shadow contains everything the ego cannot integrate, everything that is incompatible with who you have decided to be, everything that would threaten the carefully maintained self-image if it were acknowledged. The person who identifies as good has shadow containing their cruelty. The person who identifies as strong has shadow containing their weakness. The person who identifies as rational has shadow containing their irrationality. These qualities do not disappear through denial but go underground, become unconscious, operate through projection where you see in others what you cannot acknowledge in yourself, create behaviors you later cannot explain because they arise from parts of yourself the ego refuses to recognize. This split creates constant psychological warfare where you must defend against your own rejected aspects, must maintain vigilance against qualities that keep trying to emerge. You must project onto others what you cannot own in yourself, which destroys relationships by making them repositories for your denied darkness. You hate in others what you most thoroughly reject in yourself, feel most intensely triggered by people who display qualities that your shadow contains, create enemies who are actually mirrors, showing you what you refuse to see. The destruction also comes from the energy required to maintain this split, from the constant effort of keeping the shadow unconscious, from defending the ego's image against intrusions, from rejected material that will not stay rejected. The suppression exhausts you, creates inner tension that you cannot name because naming it would require acknowledging what is being suppressed, generates anxiety that seems to have no source because the source is the war you are waging against parts of yourself. Jung understood that integration of shadow is necessary for psychological wholeness, that you must own what you have projected, must acknowledge what you have denied, must bring into consciousness what has been kept in darkness. But the ego resists this integration, because integration threatens its coherence, would require admitting you are not who you believed yourself to be, would mean facing that the darkness you condemned in others exists in you as well. The ego destroys you through what Jung called inflation and deflation, through oscillating between grandiosity and worthlessness, through mistaking temporary achievements for permanent proof of superiority, and temporary failures for permanent proof of inadequacy. Inflation occurs when the ego identifies with archetypal energies or with achievements that temporarily make you feel special or chosen or different from ordinary humans. When success convinces you that you are exceptional in ways that exempt you from normal limitations, when the ego expands beyond realistic assessment of your actual capacities and begins to believe its own mythology. This inflated state feels powerful but is actually fragile, collapses as soon as circumstances contradict the grandiose self-image, leads inevitably to deflation, where the ego swings to opposite extreme and experiences itself as worthless or fundamentally flawed or completely inadequate. The person who was convinced of their superiority suddenly becomes convinced of their inferiority. The grandiosity transforms into self-hatred. The inflation gives way to depression, where you cannot see any value in yourself or your life. Both states are ego distortions. Both involve mistaking temporary circumstances for permanent truths about your worth. Both create suffering through tying your sense of value to external achievements or failures rather than to stable internal ground. The inflation creates anxiety about maintaining the superior position and creates cruelty toward those you perceive as inferior, while the deflation creates despair and paralysis and inability to act because action would risk further proof of inadequacy. Jung recognized that psychological health requires what he called right-sizing the ego, understanding that you are neither as special as inflation claims nor as worthless as deflation insists, that you are human with strengths and limitations, capable of both excellence and failure, containing both light and darkness. The mature ego can hold this complexity without swinging between extremes, can acknowledge achievements without becoming grandiose, and can face failures without collapsing into worthlessness. But most people spend their lives oscillating between these states, driven by the ego's need to be either superior or to explain why it is not superior, unable to find stable ground because the ego is always measuring worth through comparison and achievement rather than through simply being. The destruction comes from this constant swinging, from never finding peace, because peace would require the ego to accept that it is neither superior nor inferior, but is simply what it is, which the ego cannot tolerate because it needs to be special in order to feel valuable. The ego destroys you through its dependency on external validation, through organizing itself around being seen and recognized and approved by others, through making your sense of worth contingent on others' perceptions rather than on internal ground. Jung understood that the ego that needs constant validation is ego that has no stable center, is always at mercy of others' opinions, must perform continuously to maintain the approval that has become necessary for feeling adequate or valuable or even real. This dependency creates a situation where you cannot be yourself, because yourself includes aspects that might not be validated, where you must maintain persona that gains approval even when persona does not reflect who you actually are, where you become trapped in performances that exhaust you, while the authentic self remains hidden and unknown and unexpressed. The ego needs to be seen as successful, so you cannot admit struggles, needs to be seen as strong, so you cannot show vulnerability, needs to be seen as good, so you cannot acknowledge your darkness or your selfishness or your capacity for harm. The validation seeking also makes you manipulable, makes you change yourself to fit what others value, makes you abandon authentic desires in favor of desires that will be recognized and approved, makes you pursue goals that look impressive rather than goals that actually matter to you. The ego that needs validation cannot risk being different or unconventional or pursuing paths that others do not understand because lack of understanding feels like rejection, which the ego experiences as proof of inadequacy. This creates life organized around others' expectations rather than around your own values, creates constant monitoring of how you are being perceived, creates anxiety about whether you are meeting standards that were never yours, but that you have internalized as requirements for being acceptable or worthy. The ego that depends on validation is ego that can never rest, because the validation must be constantly renewed, the performance must be constantly maintained, the approval must be constantly earned through continued achievement or appropriate behavior, or whatever the ego has learned gains recognition. The destruction here is complete because it prevents you from ever knowing yourself, from ever being yourself, from ever discovering what you actually want or value or believe beneath all the adaptations designed to gain approval. You become the validation you seek, become the persona you perform, lose touch with authentic self that exists beneath the ego's need to be seen and recognized and approved by others who cannot possibly validate what they cannot see. Jung's ultimate insight was that the ego is not the enemy to be destroyed, but is structured to be transcended. That the goal is not elimination of ego, but is right relationship between ego and what Jung called the self, the larger totality of psyche that includes but is not limited to ego consciousness. The self in Jungian psychology represents wholeness, contains both conscious and unconscious, includes both light and shadow, transcends the ego's limited perspective, while including the ego's necessary functions of distinction and organization and navigation of practical reality. The path beyond ego's destruction involves what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole rather than remaining fragmented, of integrating what has been split, of bringing unconscious material into consciousness, of allowing the ego to serve the self rather than attempting to be the self. This requires recognizing ego as construction rather than as ultimate reality, requires developing capacity to observe the ego's operations without being completely identified with them, requires willingness to experience ego death and discover what remains when constructed identity dissolves. The individuation process is not comfortable, requires facing shadow and integrating what has been projected, requires withdrawing investments in personas and performances, requires releasing need for external validation and developing internal ground, requires accepting impermanence and change rather than clinging to continuity. The ego resists every step because every step threatens its dominance, threatens its sense of being center and sovereign, threatens its belief that it is you rather than recognizing that it is structure you use but are not limited to. But Jung recognized that failure to individuate, failure to transcend ego's limited perspective, failure to integrate shadow and develop relationship with self, this creates the neurosis and suffering and stagnation that characterize most human lives. The ego left unchallenged creates prison that feels like freedom, creates limitation that feels like identity, creates suffering that feels like necessary price of being yourself, when actually it is price of refusing to discover who you are beyond the ego's construction. Conclusion: your ego is destroying you through its core functions, through what it was designed to do, through mechanisms that feel necessary, but that create suffering. It destroys through demanding consistency when growth requires change, through comparison that makes every interaction competitive, through terror of transformation that keeps you trapped in outdated patterns, through splitting yourself into acceptable and unacceptable, where the rejected parts operate unconsciously, through oscillation between inflation and deflation that prevents stable ground, through dependency on validation that makes you perform rather than be authentic. Jung understood that the ego is necessary structure but dangerous master, that it must serve the larger self rather than attempting to be the totality of who you are. That transcendence requires facing what the ego defends against, integrating what it has rejected, releasing what it clings to. The destruction continues as long as you remain identified with ego, as long as you mistake the construction for reality, as long as you defend the limited self against the larger self that is trying to emerge. The path beyond destruction requires courage to face ego death, to allow constructed identity to dissolve, to discover what remains when you stop defending who you think you are and allow yourself to become who you actually are, beneath the performances and the projections and the desperate need to maintain continuity with past self that no longer exists. This is the individuation Jung described, the movement toward wholeness, the integration that alone can end the suffering the ego creates through its attempts to remain sovereign over psyche that is far larger than ego's limited perspective can encompass.